I don't know how many levels I'm planning on having. I have broad stroke sections, and that's pretty much it. So the general concepts that I want to get across are um, the chessboard idea, that I want a level where you're lied to by the chessboard, where there's a hologram. There's like a blueprint already presented to you, and it's wrong. It's not filled in correctly, and so that's an idea of like something that somebody has told to you, a blueprint that you have previously been given, may not necessarily be accurate, and you need to be open to challenging that in order to succeed. Sort of like, you know, how a lot of like toxic ideologies get passed down from uh, through family. You learn to trust your parents because they're your parents. You trust them implicitly. uh, why would they lie to you? Why would they ever tell you something that was incorrect? um, I think that that's not that I have that kind of issue with my parents particularly, but um, I think it is something that's important to call out. um, the the idea that you need to discover things for yourself is important, I think. So the blueprint, I think, kind of solves that as well. Uh, so probably maybe less than 10 blueprint levels. A level or two just explaining the idea of like time on an axis. It might be that I cut the time axis stuff, in which case time and other fiddly concepts probably is a bad title for the game, and it might end up just being the Feynman puzzle stuff. But the idea there, do you know, maybe that's not as important of a concept, really. Because the things that I actually want to talk about, the time element of the game, was talking about if you imagine movement on one axis and time on another, then you can have possibility on another axis. And the metric that the mechanic that I haven't created yet, which I need to, is being able to swap in the y-axis. So instead of jumping per se, you would move up or down, but that would be you making a decision, swapping to another universe kind of thing. And so the y-axis would then become possibility effectively, because the video that I put out on YouTube was the idea of was around, it's a Kurzgesagt video that I saw, and I really like Kurzgesagt. I think they're great. They agree with me on optimistic nihilism, which I think is a good life outlook to have, even though I am miserable a lot of the time. But one of the things that they were talking about was like, what if you imagine time as a flip book, where the entire block may have already every moment is like a galactic toddler, a universal cosmic toddler, drawing each like the smallest amount of time that's possible, that's drawn by a toddler. So you could like traverse that block, kind of like an MRI scan, and see time pass. So that's great. You could go back in time and you could see how that matter has changed, and they're all states. It's just an extra dimension. Space and time, according to Einstein, I don't understand it in any great detail, but space and time are part of the same fabric, so they're inherently linked, and you can move through space, and we move also through time. Gravity affects the passage of time, speed affects the passage of time. There are a lot of different things that curve space-time, which is all very complicated. But to me, that then necessarily, potentially means that time is traversable, and we can only move in one direction. But in theory, that would be possible. And Kurzgesagt says, well, that's quite complicated, that. What does that mean in terms of determinism? Because if time is traversable, then necessarily, if it's like a spatial dimension, it's not like you at one point you'll go, so you'll move past a particular thing and something in space in another part of the, just because you're in a particular space, it doesn't mean that something else in another space suddenly vanishes or changes just because you moved. Sometimes you might push on something and blah 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 blah. You get the idea there. Um, you can affect things in space, but they don't necessarily move in space. It's difficult to put into words, which is why I was hoping to do it in a game. But the idea is that then that would mean that time was like things have a fixed shape. It only changes over time. But then if it changes over time, that means that surely it has a fixed shape in time. So do the atoms that make you up have a fixed shape in time? In that at one particular moment they will be at such and such a place, and then at another particular moment in space and time, like a space-time coordinate, is it predetermined where that will end up? And if you think about it like that, then yeah, you could say if you had a complex enough equation, then you could predict the future. You could wind forward and backwards, and it would always happen the same way. And they say, but that's weird. That doesn't work, because what about determinism? Because then if you bring in determinism, or non-determinism, I should say, and the idea of quantum mechanics, then there's quantum superpositions, which we know don't collapse until they're interacted with. Which then means that the universe, as far as we understand it, isn't deterministic. It's still being decided as we go. And they presented that as kind of like, and also there's the concept of, well, okay, so if the universe is non-deterministic, then what that is genuinely like a toddler. But as the pages get flipped of the flip book, they get created based on the previous moment in time. The next moment in time happens, some more decisions are made, some more quantum states are collapsed, and time moves forward. Great. Except there is no concept of now. There is no one flat surface. There is no one flat page of where we are in time, because we know from the fact that GPS clocks routinely need adjusting to allow for the fact that they're traveling very, very fast, and they need slight relativistic adjustments in order to stay synced with stuff that's on the ground. We know that time slows down when you're moving quickly, and we know that time slows down when you're close to something very, very heavy, in the same way that your mass increases, your apparent mass increases as you move towards like a black hole or something. And the faster you go, the closer to light speed you get, and all that sort of governance. So that means that necessarily at different points in time, some parts of the universe are ahead of other parts of the universe. In that we say, for example, what's that going to be? So we're moving slower than things orbiting around the Earth. So when we're moving slower, time moves quicker. The closer to light speed you get, then the slower time will move for you. Is that the right way around? I think that's the right way around. Yeah, that sounds about right. So basically, there's like this time distortion based on the speed that you're traveling at. So that means that we are slightly ahead of the of GPS satellites traveling around the Earth. They experience time differently to us. So that means that we are at a different moment in time to those GPS satellites. So then that means, how can you have one single moment in time if all these different moments in time are happening at a different rate, a different time? And the idea is that then it's complicated. It's complicated. So we'll just say that as those waveforms collapse, and it may be that the bit of paper or that the this cosmic toddler is drawing on is a weird shape, and for that particular moment in time, we'll draw whatever happens at blah 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 blah. And then it basically rules out non-determinate. And they were basically saying that it's really complicated and it's quite hard to figure out, and we don't really know. We don't really know. And I thought, no, this is really straightforward. Or I think it's really straightforward. And the problem is that you start with 2 dimensions. Because if you start with 2 dimensions and you say, imagine the universe as being a 2-dimensional piece of paper with a drawing on it, immediately you've made an assumption there that the universe has to have at least 2 dimensions or there's no point in it existing. And it's no use as a model. So you can move in 2 dimensions and blah, 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 blah. And depending on how fast you're moving, that determines how fast time goes. That's actually an interesting mechanic. I'm going to write that down. It's a good job that I'm talking this through. Where am I going? Time-based puzzle. I'm just going to put it in here. Time-based puzzles. If you move faster, time moves slower. So yes. So it basically presupposes that while movement and speed is a factor in how fast time moves for you, and therefore how fast you go up, like through the flip book, so to speak, that's fine. But what if you just said, well, we'll make movement 1 dimension. You only really need 1 dimension to move in anyway. So we have a level where we do just left to right. This is the beginning. This is our universe. Flattened and then flattened again. We just have backwards and forwards. So then instead of having 2 dimensions, we just have the 1. And then we go up a dimension and we say, okay, so we've got movement in 1 dimension. But when you move... Oh, I must have turned the time thing off. I think I have. Whoops. Where's my player? Interpolate. No. On time behavior on move. Ooh, I might have broken something. Time behavior on move isn't working. Dear, oh dear. Well, we'll fix that in a second. But yeah, that was the idea, is that when you move through time. Or like moving through time takes time. Or moving through space happens over time, I should say. Then we've got this level 4, and that's what this was supposed to be, is that actually even staying still takes an amount of time. So you will always be moving through time. And sometimes, and so let's talk about and maybe even this part about what choices you have to make in life. That's maybe getting ahead of myself. So it might be that this isn't necessarily the next level. It's just that at some point I need a level to demonstrate that even when you stay still, you're going to move through time. It's just that over time you're presented with different situations, different potentialities, whatever we want to say. And you've got to make little choices. Oh, that's far too quick. I can't switch lanes, so I've got to be. This is the kind of thing that testing will bring out. So that's what that's about: is moving in time and then moving in space as well. I'm going to reach the end, and where's the level exit? Over here. There it be. Where am I going to go after this? Who knows? It's not sure. That's going to put me back at the sandbox level. So yeah, that's kind of the idea there, is that we get that second dimension. But then the third dimension, and this is where I think it makes a lot more sense. If you just squash it movement down 1 dimension in Kurzgesagt's example. If movement's 1 dimension and space, so basically if space-time is 2 dimensions, you can move in space and time happens along the other direction of the paper. or you think of it as just a really like the tiniest, like a stick. You know, you can move along the stick, and it's like a flip book, but like the most infinitesimally thin flip book. Like you're flipping just a tiny little slice of paper, and you can only move left and right on the piece of paper. So then what the Y direction would relate to is a different flip book. Every time a quantum superposition collapses, you pick the next flip book, or necessarily two flip books are created, in the sense that you have, when it went one way, when it had I think there's only ever two. A superposition is either one or t'other, isn't it? What is it? Schrodinger's cat. It's usually like an alpha particle or something, isn't it? In the detector. So anything at the quantum level, it'll either do a thing or it won't do a thing. So then necessarily, when one of those collapses, instead of it collapsing into one, why would it collapse? It would just be both. Because every quantum superposition there'll be one where it didn't happen and one where it did. So why is that not the third dimension? So then instead, it's every time you make a decision, or every time, not even necessarily you make a decision, every time one of the neurons in your brain, like an atom in there, does a particular thing, which over the course of billions of atoms doing something adds up to you making a decision, a neuron in your brain firing. That's the result of millions or billions of quantum superpositions collapsing. All of those superpositions create new states, new places that the universe could have gone, and in fact did go. It's just that instead of traversing space and time, you're traversing possibility. And so the third dimension is possibility, which then means that if you could traverse space and time, then why not also traverse possibility? Talking about all the different, the multiverse kind of gubbins, you know. I don't fully understand that or any of the string theory behind it, but it seems to make sense to me. So then I had this idea of, you know, you've got your movement in one direction, you'll move in time along the other axis, and you'll be presented with a bunch of different choices there. But then, and you'll basically, based on whatever movement you do, there will be physical components of your environment that change over time. But then also there'll be times where necessarily because of some decision that you've made or whatever it happens to be, there's no way forward in time anymore, so you have to make a way forward in possibility. And so then another chunk of level goes, another flipbook drops down on top of you, and suddenly that has its own set of time, that has its own set of space, which is probably similar to what was in the other chunk of time space, but maybe like a randomizer or something like that. I don't know yet exactly how that works, but that was the rough idea behind it. Oh, it is moving. It's just moving really, really, really slowly. Okay. Time sensitivity 2. Nope. Not on that one. On this one. Does it need to be higher? 5, maybe? I think that's probably what I've done. It is moving. It's just moving very, very slowly. 5 times faster. Movement to time factor. What the hell have I even done with that? That seems wrong. I think I've done something stupid in the script. But yeah, that's the idea behind the game. Or ideas, I should say, behind the game. But then also, I thought, well, so that's explaining time and possibility, you know? And then when I thought time and other fiddly concepts, I thought, well, let's do little story parts of it, you know? Let's figure this out and maybe end on the time one, or use all these different components to make different perspectives on the game or something like that. And the more techniques you have, the more skills or the more ways of looking at things that you learn, which is just, you know, moving in time, resetting things, putting down blueprinty bits. All of that would then help you beat the first level, which is also the last level, because you start on the first level and it's all a little bit confusing and complicated, and you're like, what the hell do I do here? And then it puts you immediately into level 2, which is just the backwards and forwards one, and says, let's start at the beginning. We'll work back to that. Don't you worry. But in theory, you could beat the first level. If you've beaten the game before, you would be able, it'll be functionally identical, and you would be able to beat the first level at the start. And I'll probably have to work out a way of, like, if they're outside this particular area by such and such a time, then assume that they know what they're doing, you know. So that's time, is extrapolating. Instead of doing a 2-dimensional movement and 1 dimension of time, do 1 dimension of movement, 1 dimension of time, 1 dimension of superpositions, which then allows Kurzgesagt's video to go beyond what they demonstrated and instead say, so there is a way for this all to work. Space and time can be, to some extent, deterministic. Things can have space-time coordinates, but they may also have a possibility coordinate, which then means that the space, it would sort of tie together. I mean, I don't know this at a physical level. This is just me making stuff up, really. But from a sensory position, that would explain why broad strokes, things do appear to be classical at a high level. You know, if I pick up something and drop it, yeah, there's a small chance that it just fizzles out of existence, but mostly it tends not to, because the odds are that we move into a reality where things just continue operating in a reasonably classical manner. The odds of us moving into a state of possibility, a possibility coordinate where something goes really weird, is unlikely. And even if we do, one of those tiny little superpositions collapses in a weird way, the next superposition that collapses might just as easily undo it. So it all sort of averages out. Kind of like if you've ever seen Brownian motion. Brownian motion is a really interesting overlay between quantum effects and well, not even quantum effects, but atomic effects, subatomic effects, and actual visible physics. It's a fun thing to look at, Brownian motion. So that's 1. 2 is, like I say, the Feynman chessboard, which is just, don't take everything that you've been told as read. It is important to understand these things for yourself. Use what other people have taught you, but, like, ultimately, people can be wrong, you know? Say, for example, I don't know, once upon a time, I was a little bit, I don't know. There's been times where I've had to adjust my point of view because I was in the wrong. You know, I'd made a decision, or I'd made an assumption or a judgment that I understood a situation. I can't think of one right now, but, like, even stuff like I don't know, what's a good example? God, I can't think of one now. But anyway, I'm sure I'll think of one. But yeah, basically that you should always be open to adjusting your model because the model that you currently have might not fit anymore. Like, you people who say, oh, well, you're a slave to science and, you believe in science. It's like, no, good scientists don't believe in anything. Good scientists are always open to new data which challenges their point of view. That's kind of the idea there, and that sometimes even scientists will give you a a a, a, a duff model. And then beyond that, there's a couple of other ones. The other one, I guess, is around self-perception. Is more about perception and like the way that you perceive yourself and others, which is the us versus them has a secret hidden third parameter, which is you, because you are always in the right. You're always correct. Even when you're in the wrong, you will usually find a way to not necessarily make yourself right, but you will always find a way to justify whatever it is that you've done. And it might take a while, you might feel guilty about something for a while, but over time, that's what your brain does. It is designed to keep going. It is designed to find ways for you to be cool with things. So it was going to be something like maybe like not necessarily enemies, but effectively levels where you are shown a behavior, and you see an object in the game hurts you or kills you or smashes the marble or something like that. I don't know how I would even achieve that, but something bad happens. When you step on a trap, you fall into a pit or something like that. And so then every time you're like, oh well, there's all these traps, and then there's a situation where you don't have a choice. There's only traps that way, and then you eventually just have to go, oh screw it, I'll roll over the trap anyway, and nothing happens. And it's a case of, yeah, just because one trap did something, it doesn't mean that every trap's going to do something. And I think this is more about like sort of the us versus them argument that happens a lot with like the trans movement, for example. Say the trans movement like it's rock and roll or something, but like a lot of like the trans rights debate, the argument that a lot of trans exclusionary radical feminists use is, but there's criminals, what's to stop some man identifying as a woman and coming into my toilets and doing things to us? And they seem to equate that behavior with trans people. And that's very much a false equivalency. The actuality is that somebody might do that, but they wouldn't just be a trans person, they would be a criminal, Like, criminals do that. That's not a trans person. Like, not all trans people are going to be like that. Are some trans people going to be like that? Yeah. Are some cis people going to be like that? Yeah. Probably a lot more, just because of the law of averages, like statistics. But, like, don't confuse the actions of one person with the actions of whatever groups that they may or may not passively or actively belong to, Like, don't assume those things about somebody. So, same sort of deal. Traps, not all traps will do that, and then it's talking about me versus us versus them, of like, you might then make them out to be the bad ones, but what do you really know about them? You don't really know anything about them. Them always stays them. It's very rare that them becomes us. It is more plausible that us becomes them. And then, although you might think us is you, it's not us. There's always you. Your definition of us will subtly change over time, and it'll move to be different people, and your definition of them probably stays more or less the same. The camp of them usually grows, the camp of us just sort of moves, and as it moves, it leaves behind it a trail of them, which is, I don't know, less scientific, but I think that it is still an important thing to think about, that there aren't really camps, there are just a lot of me's. There are lots of me's, and broad strokes, they all fit together. They tend to come together into big groups, but it's not because they're all identical. They're all individuals, they're all unique, and they all fit into different camps depending on lots of various factors. But for simplicity, we tend to group them all together. And I think that would probably be sort of an interplay between like the Feynman stuff, to sort of say like, yeah, well, broad strokes, your model is that when you put a block down, you can never move through a block, but very occasionally you can move through a block. There is a block that if it acts in a different way, if you know, Feynman's video talks about like bishops always hold their colour. And like there's only one queen on the board, and then you go, oh well, if a pawn reaches the other side of the board, then it can become a queen, and then it can move differently, and it's that sort of stuff really. And it means that every now and again you have to adjust your model. Same, like I think the trans debate's probably another really good example there, in that once upon a time I've had to educate there's an example of something where I genuinely have had to educate myself on the topic, is the trans debate, specifically around the biology of these things, because I was under the impression that there was XX and XY. That was pretty much it. So when they made the biological argument of, well, it's either one or it's other, it's, that's a binary, so why is there such a thing as a non-binary? And I'm like, well, because your psychology is different to your biology. Your psychology is based on your biology, like inherently, because it is the noise and heat of a running engine is, I suspect, what we'll probably find consciousness is. It's just what happens when the engine is moving. You can't see it when the engine is stopped, because the engine stopped. But I was very much of the opinion that it was one or t'other. But then I looked into it, and it turns out that no, that's not true. The only thing that defines whether you're male or female, in that sense, is the SRY gene. So you can be genetically XX, but developmentally, I could technically be XX right now, and I would never know it unless I went and got a genetic test. And a lot of people assume that having more than 2 chromosomes is pretty much, that's it. You're gonna end. You'll be born with Down syndrome. I vaguely recall that that's not exactly the case. I'm not 100% certain there, but I think it's not a guarantee, or not as much of a guarantee as some people seem to think. So there are situations where this SRY gene can end up in a place where you didn't expect it to be. And similarly, the hormones that your body then releases is based on the chromosomes that you've got, and the sex determination chromosomes aren't always exactly responsible for all of that stuff, and you can have effectively an endocrine and a hormonal system that is different to what your physical characteristics would suggest. So you can actually have the brain chemistry of somewhere in the middle, or not quite the brain chemistry that you would normally have, where you when I say ideal, I don't mean like perfect or good. I just mean like all the way to one end or all the way to the other end. And as it turns out, we've known about this stuff 30 years, 40 years, which funnily enough is when a lot of people stopped learning about this stuff. And most of this stuff would never make it into the high school curriculum, which is kind of wild. So, um, effectively, we're in a situation where the science moved on quite a while ago, and people are still quoting out, even some scientists are quoting out of date science from 20, 30 years ago as if it's fact and it's something that needs to be adhered to, something that should be held up. And it's no, the model changed a long time ago. The model is probably more complex again, the fact that what we've observed so far, and we don't do genetic tests on every single human being that's born. We don't have any idea of the level of like incidence of various different genetic makeups. We have no idea what that looks like. We're still only just starting to scratch the surface of how, developmental biology works. And yet there's these people like throwing out these opinions as if it's like, yep, that's a guarantee, that's all settled, the science is done, and the science says, no, you have to adjust your model because your model can and often will be wrong. Anything that we do is just an approximation. Once upon a time we thought that like the atom, for example, looked like a plum pudding, was just a bit of cake with raisins on the outside of it, and that was the electrons stuck to the positive bit, because of course they would be attracted to each other. And then later on we came up with the 1950s kitsch atom of, the little ball in the middle and then all the electrons spin around the outside. And then that turned out to be not really quite right, because then it's, probability density charge clouds, or whatever they call them, with s orbitals and p orbitals and d orbitals and f orbitals that all have weird different shapes. And technically speaking, even those shapes aren't 100% likely to have the actual electron, the actual particle in there. It could also be somewhere else. There's a very small chance that it could be in none of those places. It could be somewhere else entirely. But it's probably where it is. And that's getting into like the probabilistic elements of physics at that point. And this is the sort of stuff that's kind of wild, is that there's so many people who base these ideas on things that are just, they're abstract, they're not real. Reality is far too complicated for us to understand. It's insanely difficult to even try and wrap your head around. So we make models that are simplistic and help us try and understand way more complicated ideas. Time and other fiddly concepts. All of them are just concepts. They're just ideas. They're just models that we have created to try and help us see things a little bit more clearly. But you've always got to hold in your mind that really it's all just a load of cobblers. It's all just something that we made up to try and help us understand something too complicated for us to ever understand. And then, I suppose the other one, which is it more complicated? I don't know. It's basically just an idea of like, I think there's a lot of people who figure all of this stuff out, but then they forget to take the last few steps. There's a lot of people who I've known who've just been terrible human beings, like really nasty people, because for no bigger reason than they've figured out that they've decided that God isn't real. God didn't make the universe. The universe is much more likely to just exist, or to be the spawn of another universe, or based on all of this quantum rubbish, maybe it's even a simulation, and they just never expected the simulation to start self-examining and get to the point where it could see that kind of thing. I think somebody mentioned it in the chat once. Catching God with their pants down. That's kind of what quantum dynamics is it's an accident that we found it, because none of the people who wrote the simulation were expecting us to ever need to see things in this detail. So that's kind of where that comes from. So you get to a point where you realize, oh well, if you want to, if you're rationally minded, you sort of start to think, well, if God's not real, then morality isn't real either, is it? Morality can't be real if God isn't real. In which case, ethics and anything else isn't real, and I can just do whatever the hell I like. I can be mean to people, and it's okay. I can, I don't know. I can just generally walk around like a mouth-breathing neckbeard kind of thing. Like the kinds of people who are just really odious to other human beings for no other reason than they think that they're right. They think that they're better than everybody else. Or because people have been mean to them, so blah, 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 whatever it happens to be. People being mean to you doesn't give you an excuse to be mean to other people. I don't know. So I then think of it in terms of they're so close. They came so close to getting it exactly right. In that, funnily enough, I think, what's it, the Assassin's Creed thing? What is it? Nothing is true, everything is permitted. So the idea is that no, nothing is true. There is no objective reason why English is the way it is, why Spanish is the way it is. It's just all just weird happenstance that's happened over lots of accidents and mistakes. There is no design in any of this. There is physics at the bottom of it, but that's too complicated for us to understand. So society, ethics, the way that we build houses, it's all just from rules of thumb and just weird ideas that we've come up with. And when you get to that point, the first thing you think is, well, yeah, I can just act however I want. I can completely act the goat because there's no reason for me not to act the goat. I'll be a dreadful human being. Except then you realise that nothing is true, everything is permitted, or whatever, however you want to phrase it. There's sort of a flip side to that, in that, yeah, there's no such thing as ethics, but there is a such thing as other people. And if the consensus is, there is no truth, but there is consensus. So if the consensus is that people don't like to be killed and you kill somebody, yeah, there's no rule against it. There's no law of the universe that's going to say, if you kill somebody, then your atoms will immediately disintegrate into the fine quantum foam of reality. No, but all of the people around you who perceive you and have thoughts and opinions much like you, they'll have something to say about it, and they won't care for it at all. I suppose it depends on who you kill, but more than likely they're not going to like it. So the last step that I think so many of these people need to take is just realizing that they need to exist in society, that we need to support each other, we need to be together, People don't do very well on their own. And it's just about being, and this is why so many religions have the same ideology at their core of like, treat other people the way you want to be treated, operate in a consensus. Whatever you think's right and wrong, other people are going to feel that way. And they say, oh, well, I get to do it. It's the same thing about like free speech. Like, freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequence. You can say whatever you want, but other people are going to have thoughts and feelings about that. So maybe don't say the terrible thing. But at the same time, maybe if you accidentally or even on purpose said a terrible thing, you would probably appreciate the opportunity to walk it back, So maybe instead of us all constantly being at loggerheads and, the left versus the right and, up versus down, back versus front, how about we all just sort of recognize that we're individuals who are all fallible, and as long as we're not actively harming other human beings, we try to get back to a little bit of, well, I say back to as if we ever really had it, but we try and open some sort of discourse. But yeah, that's kind of the concepts that I want to get into the game. So I don't know how many levels that represents, but it's some. It's an amount of levels. And some of that will probably never make it into the game. But that's kind of the broad strokes of what I want to get in, is time, the idea of models not necessarily being real, perception around that sort of thing, and then I guess whatever that last thing I said was, you know, what do you do with all this information once you actually have it? I should probably clip that, shouldn't I?